Dr. Boney, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't you go ahead so you're going to be, so you're from Amazon Games, so you're the user experience research lead. So we're going to let you introduce yourself, talk to us a little bit about what you're going to talk about, and then I will flip this over to you and you can go ahead and share your presentation, okay?
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Boney, and I am a user experience researcher, but most importantly and first and foremost, I am a narrative personality psychologist. So today I'm going to be taking you through my body of work, which is my dissertation study, just talking to you about this. It's a narrative personality exploratory study about cultural narratives in computer science, African-American computer science majors. This work is very important to me because I am both a psychologist and a user experience researcher in tech. And a lot of my work likes to see how we can merge the fields to engage and expand our learning. So it's a multidisciplinary study. You'll see aspects of psychological scientific science, but then you'll also see aspects of user research science as well.
Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to let you let me know if you have any issues with that.
Perfect. I believe I am sharing. Give me 1 second.
And we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Oh, let me move this to the side so I can see everyone. Okay, perfect. I am ready to get started.
Excellent. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Thanks. All righty. So again, like I said, my name is Dr. Boney, and I am a narrative personality psychologist, but also a user experience researcher. So this body of work, a narrative personality exploratory study, the Superwoman schema as a cultural narrative in the lives of African-American women computer science majors was actually my dissertation study. And as I said, it combines aspects of psychological science as well as user research science. So just to give some context, I started my doctoral matriculation as an alumna of the University of Miami with a degree in psychology and criminology. So my original research interests focused on criminogenic personality correlates, maladaptive school behaviors, and perceived life chances because, surprise, surprise, I aspired to be a criminal profiler, watched way too many episodes of Criminal Minds, CSI, those things, and I just knew I was going to be a criminal profiler. So I went to school at Howard University in DC. What better way to get into the government by going to school in the nation's capital? But however, as introspection and reflection really became an integral part of my practice as a psychologist, I realized that my research begins with me. So I was actually introduced to narrative personality research by my then advisor, Dr. Winston Proctor, and through the emerging narrative literature, membership in a narrative personality health psychology collaborative research lab, as well as the National Science Foundation Broadening and Participation Research and Identity and Success Research Lab, along with being a user experience researcher in tech, I really wanted my research to reflect the contribution that narrative personality psychology can make to the understanding of the human personality by engaging in research that affords the opportunity to minimize the disproportionate rates in which African-American women are subjected to poor health and health outcomes. By understanding these culturally specific mechanisms that guide interpretation of experiences to shape identity and related behaviors. So these have implications not only on the study of human personality, but how scientists every day should approach the study of African-American women, and specifically African-American women in white male-dominated spaces. So I really like to thank everyone for joining me this afternoon, and I would like to welcome you to my body of work. So the central question here is like, what do we mean when we say we know a person? And this is kind of our whole person approach to psychology. So there are African-American women who have thrived in their educational and professional achievements in computer science. but the psychological experiences of these women are not well understood by scholars within the field of science of broadening participation. The majority of research studies on computing focus primarily on the experiences of race or gender separately, and this approach does not sufficiently address or capture the unique intersectional experiences of African American women in this educational context. Psychological theories that focus on race and gender identity jointly help to explain the meaning students obtain from their social group membership, and understanding this is beneficial to research concerning both African American and female students. Additionally, African American women disproportionately experience environmental stressors, including institutional, systematic, and cultural oppression that have an impact on health. Healthcare statistics reveal that Black women are disproportionately represented amongst healthcare patients for an array of unfavorable health conditions, including cardiovascular disease, obesity, lupus, adverse birth outcomes, chronic stress, and psychological conditions. The aforementioned disproportionate health conditions is theorized to be affected by the ways in which Black women cope with stress. Research also suggests that the Superwoman schema functions as a cognitive framework that guides African American women in organizing and interpreting information and experiences, and also guides many of Black women's stress management practices and behaviors. As computer science majors, African American women are more susceptible to environments that present. American women computer science majors employ the Superwoman schema as a cultural narrative to reinterpret these experiences as a buffer to the harmful reality. This study integrates theoretical approaches from personality, narrative identity, and the Superwoman literatures, which largely have been isolated from one another. Relatedly, the former two perspectives have neglected a substantive focus on African American women, a group whose lived experiences are complicated by the culture of living in a racialized society. This gap in the literature is supported by Conway and Playdell Pierce, 2000, who are personality psychologists, which suggests that the research on the development of narrative identity would benefit from a broader consideration of the role of culture. So a culturally specific approach to describe the ways African American women interpret and cultivate meaning of their educational experiences will add to the available knowledge about mechanisms of narrative identity development in African Americans and literature on the science of broadening participation. Such knowledge will also be useful for future research, educational program development, and culturally specific efforts to promote behavioral health and minimize this disproportionate rates at which African American women are subjected to poorer health conditions and outcomes. So the purpose of my work was to expand understanding across multiple knowledge bases, as well as stimulate more culturally responsive discourse about broadening African American women's participation in computer science. By utilizing a very popular personality framework, McAdams and Powell's 2006, their whole person personality approach to describe a comprehensive view of personality, which includes cultural themes of narrative identity development and perceived stress in a small, convenient sample of African American women computer science majors. This exploratory descriptive study is designed to advance the theoretical and methodological approaches used to study narrative identity development generally, and specifically within African American women. Additionally, this study utilized the only quantitative measure of narrative identity to describe the awareness and created a culturally responsive facet of narrative identity by adding a cultural coherence subscale of the narrative identity awareness questionnaire. So to kind of put that in layman's terms, before my study, there was only one quantitative measure of what narrative identity was. And that quantitative measure did not include a cultural facet, in which we've learned that that's very important to the way African American women shape their lives and stories. So with the help of my advisor, I actually created my own quantitative measure to assess narrative identity holistically as it pertains to African American women. So our theoretical framework. This study integrated 3 theoretical frameworks. The first was the theory of race self-complexity, and it describes how the meaning of race adds complexity to the self system and includes explanations of how the meaning of race can be processed narratively among individuals who live within the culture of a racialized society. It integrated theories of narrative as well as personality and psychological significance of race theories. The next theory that the study used was the McAdams and Powell's new Big Five. If you're into personality, this is kind of the holy grail of personality research. And it's a comprehensive system for classifying the basic rudimentary tenets of personality. It's comprised of 5 principles and 3 domains of personality. To answer that question, what do we mean when we say we know a person? McAdams and Powell describes these 3 domains as dispositional signature, characteristic adaptations, and life narrative. And in this theoretical framework, they define personality as an individual's unique variation on the general evolutionary design for human nature, expressed as a developing pattern of dispositional traits, characteristic adaptations, self-defining life narratives, complexly and differentially situated in cultural and social contexts. This definition of personality places an emphasis on the nature of self-defining life narratives, complexly and differentially situated in cultural and social contexts, which positions the role of culture at the center of life narratives and life narratives at the center of human personality. To further support McAdams and Powell's 2006 framework, I also incorporated narrative theory. So narrative approaches to understanding of human personality propose that human beings interpret their lives as progressive stories that establish identity, influence behavior, and integrate individuals into their social environments. Additionally, theory suggests that the life story construction is one of the foundational elements that promotes self-understanding, and that to understand identity and identity development is to understand how individuals create narratives of the self from their personal experiences, revisit these stories internally, and share them with others, while applying them to the knowledge of the self, others, and the world. So lastly, the superwoman schema is an evolutionary social adaptation for survival to counter the effects of racism and sexism dating back to the pre-antebellum period. And it has become a central component of the identity of Black women. Research suggests that the superwoman schema, a byproduct of Black women's combined experiences of racism and sexism, guides many of Black women's stress management practices, behaviors, and includes both avoidant and high effort coping, delayed minimal self-care, and various other maladaptive behaviors that can lead to premature decline in physical and psychological health. Consistent with the theoretical underpinnings of the theory of race self-complexity, the study integrates personality, narrative identity, and the superwoman schema theories. This theoretical joining is one that I believe would really enrich the opportunities to study simultaneously and inform the further expansion of multiple fields of study within and outside of the field of psychology. So here we're looking to be able to touch health psychology, we're looking able to be able to touch tech, we're looking to be able to touch educational research, as well as that big emphasis on the National Science Foundation and how they work to broaden participation in STEM fields. So now we're going to get into a quick summary of the literature so that we can really get into what we found. So first I want to give everybody a little bit of an understanding of what narrative identity is and the person as the autobiographical author. I said narrative identity a million times. I'm sure people are like, what is narrative identity? So narrative identity is the internalized and evolving narrative of the self that incorporates the reconstructed past and the imagined future into a more or less coherent whole. This provides the person's life with a degree of unity, purpose, and meaning. Consistent with Erickson, 1958, who is a developmental psychologist and identity psychologist, consistent with his developmental model of identity, in emerging adulthood, individuals become autobiographical authors. in an effort to create stable self-identity that provides themselves with a sense of temporal continuity and a deep meaning, which is a way of being layered over the self as a motivational agent. This creates a life story that is unique to the individual, and interpretations of past experiences are filtered through these images, metaphors, ideologies, and narratives that culture provides. In essence, human personality is an evolving integration of an individual's characteristic variation on the evolved design for human nature, characterized by psychological individuality, in which life stories are layered over salient goals and values that are layered over dispositional traits, over developmental time through culture. So how does this play into well-being? Well, the process of arranging life experiences into a meaningful narrative form is a dynamic mechanism of psychological functioning. McLean et al. 2020 examined the association of this empirical structure of life narratives with hedonic well-being and health. And they found that more positive or redemptive narratives are associated with more positive well-being, and that more negative narratives are associated with more negative well-being. There's also a significant body of research linking narratives of redemptive meanings from suffering and adversity to higher levels of psychological well-being, generativity, and other indices of successful adaptation to life. However, it really is important here to consider the social context of formulating a meaningful story. As it relates to African American women within a racialized society, forming redemptive meanings are often at the cost of exacerbating personal resources to engage in strict behaviors associated with these culturally prescribed descriptions of successful adaptation to life. This is also supported by McLean et al.'s 2020 finding that the structure factor for stressful events were related to higher levels of distress. Additionally, studies have shown that coherent accounts of past experiences are associated with higher levels of psychological well-being, but that coherence can also be related to poorer well-being in the context of traumatic events, like racism. These findings suggest that there are moderators of the relationship between narrative and well-being. So when do we develop this narrative identity? So not surprisingly, there was a shift in the narrative literature, which originally posited that the emergence of life narratives happens in emerging adulthood, which was in line with Erikson's psychosocial developmental stages. However, McAdams, Habermas, and Bluck, along with many other personality theorists, have made claims supported by empirical data that the life story emerges in adolescence. So life stories draw on the stories that people learn as active participants in culture. So that's stories about adulthood, adolescence, childhood, and aging. And parents facilitate autobiographical authorship through the stories that they share with their children about the culturally prescribed ways to live. Fundamental to the integration of experiences is the ability to form coherent accounts of these experiences across one's life. So Habermas and Bluck introduced 4 aspects of life story coherence. That's temporal coherence, causal coherence, thematic coherence, and cultural coherence. So temporal coherence is the ability to accurately perceive the order in which experiences have occurred over the lifetime to date. Causal coherence is the perception that experiences are meaningfully associated and that events have causal connections with self-identity. Thematic coherence is the ability to draw out similarities between episodes in life and identify overarching themes that act as integrated interpretations of these events. And cultural coherence is the integration of cultural norms about phases of the lifespan, what a story about life should contain, and what represents a significant event in one's narrative about the self. And so here I'll make a note. I said that there was only one quantitative measure of this narrative identity awareness. And in this quantitative measure, it measured temporal coherence, causal coherence, and thematic coherence. coherence. Now, while cultural coherence has been defined by these researchers, they did not add a measure of cultural coherence into that instrument, which we felt was important because we see that culture shapes a big part of African Americans and African American women's story. So we can't fully understand this narrative identity awareness holistically if we haven't factored in what that cultural coherence means to them. So next, we'll kind of get into the historical context of the Superwoman schema. So the Superwoman schema is a cognitive framework that guides African American women in organizing and interpreting information and experiences, and it's essential to the conceptualization of the self. And so this is rooted in the socio-cultural historical context of African American women combined experiences of racism and sexism. A growing amount of evidence has demonstrated links between disproportionate health conditions, psychological stress, and coping in the Superwoman literature. It has gained attention for its reported function as a culturally specific schema that influences African American women's experiences and reports of stress, stress management practices, and behavioral health. One of the leading researchers in the Superwoman schema is Dr. Scombe, and she developed a conceptual framework that provides a comprehensive and multidimensional description of the cognitive, affective, and behavioral underpinnings of the strong Black woman or Superwoman schema. And so you'll see these kind of interchange. Sometimes it's related as the strong Black woman schema, and sometimes it's referred to as the Superwoman schema. So these behavioral underpinnings of the Superwoman role, they examine their relationship between stress and health. And the study identifies 5 central themes of the Superwoman schema. That was the obligation to manifest strength, the obligation to suppress emotions, resistance to being vulnerable or dependent, determination to succeed despite limited resources, and obligation to help others. So African American women report racial discrimination as particularly salient and a chronic psychosocial stressor over the life course. And Thomas et al. Studied the role of culturally specific coping strategies on the relationship between gender racism and psychological distress of African American women. Their study found that coping with stress via cognitive emotional debriefing, such as avoided thinking, like the characteristics of the Superwoman schema, proved to be ineffective in reducing stress. Allen et al. 2009 expanded this TMS model by considering the role of the Superwoman schema in relation to racial discrimination and allostatic load, and found that 4 of the Superwoman schema subscales were significantly related to racial discrimination. Specifically, the study revealed that the obligation to manifest strength and an obligation to suppress emotions were found to be protective, whereas the determination to succeed despite limited resources and the obligation to help others exacerbated the independent health risk associated with experiencing racial discrimination. Lastly, Black and Wishart-Scombe 2012 stress and strength hypothesis explains how both preventative and enhancing health behaviors may be compromised by an exhaustion of personal resources through engaging in strength behaviors that characterize the central themes of the Superwoman schema. So now that we know what narrative identity is, we have a historical background of what the Superwoman schema is and how that relates to well-being and health, we're going to talk a little bit about African American women in STEM. So Geronimus and Geronimus et al., their weathering framework proposes that the social, cultural, historical context of African American women's life experiences are situated within an accumulation of racial inequality, political, economic, and social exclusion, as well as discriminatory health practices. Harrell's 2011 study supports this finding, in which they analyzed multiple pathways linking racism to health outcomes and found that repeated encounters with individual or institutionalized racism can elicit physiological reactions subconsciously, in which the physical setting or social environment where reactions have occurred may also result in physiological activation. So basically what it is saying is that repeated encounters with racism elicit physiological responses that we don't realize. So that's increased cortisol levels, increased sweating, increased heartbeat, psychological distress. And institutional and individual forms of gender racism are more likely to be encoded as episodic memories, sometimes consciously, that can take the form of stressful events that elicit appraisal and coping processes, operating through classical conditioning. And we all know Pavlov and his dogs, they heard the bell and they salivated, in the same way of a repeated encounter with gender racism elicits a response, which is normally a distress physiological response. Mwendo et al. 2011 also supports this aforementioned finding by suggesting that repeated exposure to racism requires African Americans to develop a chronic anticipatory state with consequential effects on the body's psychological response to threats. So in this sense, you're kind of anticipating that you're going to meet racism, you're going to be encountered with gendered racism, and so the physiological response, that fight or flight, is already taken has already taken place before you even get to a racist encounter because of the repeated exposure. And that psychological response, physiological response, looks like increased cortisol levels, high blood pressure, and compromised immune functioning. Research on women in STEM documents that these challenges still persist compoundly due to the unique lived experiences of African American women in a racialized society in which their social identities belong to two of society's most traditionally oppressed and underrepresented groups in STEM educational settings: people of color and women. Malcolm Hall and Brown's 1976 Hallmark study also coined a term, what we call the double blind phenomenon, which is simple to double jeopardy, in which women of color navigate gendered racial barriers in STEM education and career environments. And these findings provide evidentiary support for a relationship between the nature of STEM environments and health. So now on to the juicy part of this, and it's those research questions. So to approach the understanding of African American women computer science majors' psychological experiences that is culturally competent, I asked two questions. What is the nature of personality of African American computer science majors with varied patterns of behavioral health? And what are the patterns of narrative identity awareness in terms of themes of narrative coherence, as well as this culturally specific narrative theme of the Superwoman scheme? And so to go back and kind of wrap these questions into everything that we've been talking about, we want to answer the question, what do we know when we say we know a person? We want to look at African American women computer science majors from a whole person perspective as it relates to their narrative identity, as it relates to their cultural identity, and as it relates to their behavioral health. So our research design and methodology. As personality psychological science practitioners, we find much value in utilizing person-centered approaches to understanding and describing human personality. So a lot of times we employ what we call the case study design, and it can be used to examine an individual life or group of human lives by either one, exemplifying or displaying an a priori conceptualization, by two, discovering new information by examining the flesh and blood of the socially constructed realities perceived in terms of the individual life, rather than in terms of a predetermined abstraction, or lastly, by making comparisons of an individual's life with theory of personality, multiple lives in a search for commonalities and differences, and or different theories of personality. So this study employed a collective comparison case study design to describe the similarities and differences between African American women computer science majors who share similar life experiences. And we did this to highlight the strength and limitations of the current conceptual and theoretical frameworks in accounting for the unique lived experiences and perceived stress of African American women in a racialized society. My collective case study design is also an attempt to extend this narrative identity literature to make logical inferences about how the nomothetic truths about personality play out, or sometimes don't, in the lives of African American women in computer science. So because case study methodology likes to examine the unique individual lives, you don't need a very large sample. So the sample for the study consisted of 3 African-American women college students between the ages of 18 and 31 years old. The African-American Women in Computer Sciences survey included demographic information in 6 measures. So the first measure was the awareness of narrative identity questionnaire for African-American women. And so just to wrap this back to what we've been saying, there was only one quantitative measure to measure narrative identity, and that was the narrative identity awareness questionnaire. But as we've learned, that cultural coherence and cultural prescriptions of storytelling is very important and essential to the identity of African-American women. So we adapted that original measure to then include a cultural component to assess that cultural coherence aspect of African-American women's narrative identity, which ended up being the awareness of narrative identity questionnaire for African-American women. It was used to describe the participants' self-reported awareness of the presence of one's life stories about the self derived from past experiences and their perceived coherence. It's a 26-item measure with 5 4-item subscales and 1 6-item subscale, which assesses general awareness, temporal coherence, causal coherence, thematic coherence, and cultural coherence of life narratives. It was adapted from Hawthorne and Mellor's 2016 Awareness of Narrative Identity Questionnaire, and is operationalized by the Woods-Giscombe Superwoman Schema Questionnaire. This scale was adapted using the following criteria. So first, I eliminated items that were not developmentally appropriate for college students who were in emerging adulthood. I retained items that may be specific to the experiences of undergraduate women in computer science. And I also retained items depicting more general life experiences versus specific experiences. McLean et al. Points out that a limitation of the field is the multitude of ways of capturing narrative features with little attention to the overall dimensions of latent factors or narrative that are responsible for the associations of well-being, and that quantitative measures of narrative identity will offer clues regarding the relationship between these dimensions of narrative and well-being. Also, without a quantitative measure and index, we cannot look at large samples and multivariate analysis in the future. And additionally, as I said, this is the only quantitative measure of narrative identity and has only been used in 2 other studies outside of mine. Next, we measured behavioral health with the perceived stress scale, and that's a 14-item 5-point Likert scale that is used to describe the global perceptions of stress and operates under the underlying principle that stressful events perceived as threatening or demanding can increase the risk of health problems. We also used the Big 5 inventory to modify to assess participants' dispositional personality traits, and it's the first domain of that McAdams and Powell's whole person framework. Next, we used the general self-efficacy scale to describe McAdams and Powell's second domain of personality, which are the characteristic adaptations. And that's a self-report of individual agreement and confidence in performing effectively across tasks and situations. And again, the reason why we are using scales for each of the domains of McAdams and Powell's is because we're trying to create a view of the whole person. So McAdams and Powell's has divided the whole person into 3 domains, and we want to look at each of those domains as it relates to African-American women in computer science, as it relates to African-American women and their cultural prescriptions of narratives, as it relates to African-American women in computer science and their behavioral health and perceived stress. Lastly, we looked at the science identity of African-American women, and using the computer science identity scale, it was adapted to describe participants' computer science identity, defined as the extent to which participants are oriented toward the role of computer science. So this original scale is called the Science Identity Scale by Estrada et al. 2011, and we adapted it, and the way that we did that is just changed the last word. So in each of the items, it has I have a strong sense of belonging to the community of scientists, and we just added, I have a strong sense of belonging to the community of computer scientists. Lastly, as I said, just Gombe's Superwoman Schema Questionnaire was used to describe participants' identification with the Superwoman by asking participants to indicate whether the statement was true or not about themselves. If the statement was true, participants were asked to identify if the statement bothered them. So an example of one of the statements was, I put pressure on myself to achieve a certain level of accomplishment. And so they would either say that it's not true for me or this is true for me. And they would say the rate at which it is true for me. So rarely, sometimes, or all of the times. And if they said that the statement was true for them, then they would be prompted to ask how much that statement bothers them. So that's not at all, somewhat, or very much. So my study was conducted using a web-based software called Qualtrics and given to participants nationwide. I think one thing that is important to note here is that the amount of African-American women in computer science is very, very low, probably less than 1,000. And this was around last year when I was conducting the study. So this year, it could have grown. The rates fluctuate. So with the National Science Foundation broadening participation, they fund STEM at colleges to get more African-American students, get more underrepresented students in STEM education. So the rates fluctuate. Sometimes our enrollment is higher, sometimes our enrollment is lower. And so when I conducted my study, it was less than 1,000 people in the entire United States that were African-American women in computer science. So consistent with IRB protocol, consent was obtained prior to participants completing their self-reported questionnaire. To recruit my participants, I used network contacts, and myself, as well as the principal investigator, which was my advisor, shared the link of the study and flyer via social media. So we used LinkedIn to recruit, we used Twitter to recruit, we used Facebook to recruit, but it was, like I said, a convenient, simple. So upon clicking the study link, participants were directed to informed consent, and they had to read and electronically agree to their participation being voluntary. Also, as with all ethics and research, they are free to leave the study at any time. They did not need to finish the study. If they said consent and they answered 5 questions and they were done, they were free to leave. The participant must have chosen that they consent in order to let them move forward. So if they did not choose that button, they weren't going to be able to move forward with the study. And if the participant did consent, the next screen led to a demographics questionnaire. If the person did not identify as Black or African-American, or if they did not identify as a computer science major or minor, they were skipped to the end of the study. And we maintained confidentiality throughout this process, and the names of participants were not identified on the questionnaires. So now we're getting into the results. So of the 6 participants in this study, only 3 completed the entire questionnaire. 2 participants are treated after the demographic questionnaire, and the remaining participant are treated after the dispositional trait measure. So that just means that they exited out after that. All participants were between the ages of 18 and 31, with the majority of participants ranging between the ages of 20 and 24 and classified as being in their junior year of college. 2 of the participants were listed as computer science majors, and 1 participant was listed as a computer science minor. So what is the nature of personality of African-American computer science majors with varied personalities of behavioral health? So to describe this nature of African-American women computer science majors with varied patterns of behavioral health, we use the Big 5 inventory, and their scores are shown. So the inventory revealed that participants had high similarity and agreeableness and conscientiousness, with the 2 domains being the highest scores of all participants. Participants' dispositional scores are also consistent with their Superwoman scores and consistent with the Superwoman literature, which states that agreeableness and conscientiousness are 2 domains that can be found in the latent meanings of the Superwoman narrative. Conscientiousness includes the descriptors of self-efficacy, orderliness, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, and cautiousness, and they align with the Superwoman themes of obligation to manifest strength, resistance to being vulnerable or dependent, and determination to succeed despite limited resources. Agreeableness, which includes descriptors of trust, morality, altruism, cooperation, modesty, and sympathy, align with the Superwoman's themes of obligation to manifest strength. and the obligation to help others. When we looked at the nature of the personality of African-American computer science majors with varied patterns of behavioral health further, we saw that participants had high similarity within their responsibility facet scales. And with each participant scoring a 4, it's also consistent with the Superwoman theory and the Superwoman subscales. So responsibility includes descriptors that align with the Superwoman themes of determination to succeed despite limited resources, obligation to manifest strength, and obligation to help others. Participant scores on the domain scale, negative emotionality, and facet scales, anxiety and depression, were low similarity and of their lowest scores. And these scores also support the Superwoman literature that the Superwoman narrative has differential effects on the psychological experiences of African-American women, highlighted by Allen et al. In their TMS model. And that suggests that the obligation to manifest strength and the obligation to suppress emotions were found to be protective, whereas the determination to succeed despite limited resources and the obligation to help others exacerbated that independent health risk associated with experiencing racial discrimination. To describe the patterns of narrative identity awareness in terms of themes of narrative coherence, as well as the culturally specific narratives of the Superwoman, the Awareness of Narrative Identity Questionnaire for African-American Women and the Superwoman questionnaire are shown. So here you have the scores of both of those scales. And the results reveal high similarity between participant scores on the Superwoman questionnaire, with each participant having a high Superwoman score. The Superwoman theory and participant scores on the Big 5 inventory and the domain facet scales support this description. Sorry, I don't know why that flipped. So participants A and B have high similarity in narrative awareness, scoring fairly low on that measure, and participant C scored highest overall, but their score is still relatively low. These scores are also consistent with Erickson's 1958 developmental model of identity. And it says that in emerging adulthood, individuals become autobiographical authors in an effort to create this stable self-identity. These findings are also consistent with the significance of the study, which suggests that lower scores for all participants on the measure of narrative identity awareness illustrates how approaches to studying the unique lived experiences of African-American women must place the role of culture at the center of assessment. Additionally, consistent with the case study methodology, scores indicate how the nomothetic truths of narrative identity sometimes don't play out when looking at the unique experiences of individual lives. Lastly, these findings support generational differences in defining Black womanhood, as participants A and B are Generation Z and participant C is a millennial, and we'll discuss that later. So I said earlier that I combine aspects of psychological science as well as user research science. And so here we'll see that combination, which makes this a multidisciplinary study. So narrative personality psychologists and user experience researchers alike sometimes use quantitative data to tell a qualitative story. So to describe a comprehensive view of the nature of personality across McAdams and Powell's 3 domains, as well as these cultural themes of narrative identity development, I have presented 3 persona profiles. Personas are fictional characters that represent your target audience, and that's something that is used heavily in the user experience research. Although it is not a real person, it is based on real data and facts obtained through interviews, surveys, and other forms of research. Personas are used to build empathy with your target audience, and in this case with my participants, personify our data, and create a comprehensive view of unique experiences of our population. So here we're going to take a look at Superwoman Persona A. Superwoman Persona A is a motivated, responsible student who perceives her life to be high stress. As a member of Generation Z, she is not fully yet aware of how her life story explains who she is, but she is somewhat aware of how culture shapes that story. And we can see there with her narrative identity scores, how that cultural coherence piece is her highest score. Her dispositional traits align with a strong identification with the Superwoman schema, and her social membership of both a Superwoman and computer science may contribute to her higher sense of self-efficacy, but also her moderate depression. Here we present Superwoman persona B, who is also a self-motivated, responsible student, but she also perceives her life to be high stressed. As a member of Generation Z, she is not fully aware of how her life story explains who she is, but she is moderately aware of how both time and culture shape her story. And you can see here how she has higher scores of temporal coherence as well as cultural coherence. She has a strong identification with both the Superwoman and computer scientist identity, and that may contribute to her high self-efficacy, but also may manifest as moderate to high depression and anxiety. And that just goes back to how we were talking about how the Superwoman schema has both deteriorative and protective mechanisms. Next, we'll look at persona C, and Superwoman persona C is our millennial. So persona C is a self-motivated, responsible student. As a millennial woman who has had more time in emerging adulthood and adolescence, she is more aware of how her narrative life reflects who she is and how culture shapes that story. Her strong identification with the Superwoman and her low identification with computer science may contribute to high self-efficacy and low feelings of depression. However, these competing identities may also contribute to her moderate anxiety. And here it's really important to look at the context of time. So Generation Z in culture has been more empowered to do the things that make them happy, more empowered to break barriers, more empowered to be women in STEM. And so in a time when millennials were growing up, it was a lot less empowerment for women to be in STEM. It was a lot less of do what feels right, do what makes you happy, break those ceilings. And so here we'll see with millennials, there's a lot of conflict between who they are as computer scientists and who they are as women. And so if we look at the commonalities among our Superwoman profiles, we see that all personas had high perceived stress scores, and that is really supported by the stress and strength hypothesis. For African-American women in a racialized society, the formulation of redemptive meanings are often at the cost of exacerbating personal resources to engage in these strength behaviors associated with the culturally prescribed descriptions of successful adaptation to life, and its significance to the premises of my study that culture is the prescriptive element of the narrative structure of African-American women, and that the nature of repeated engagement with environmental stressors is likely to have differential effects on stress and well-being. So personas A and B have high perceived stress and high computer science identity, which is supported by the Geronimus weathering framework, as well as Harrell et al.'s 2011 multiple pathways linking racism to health outcomes, and Mwendwa et al.'s 2011 findings about the chronic anticipatory state of African-American women due to repeated encounters with individual or institutional racism. In contrast of personas A and B, persona C had higher narrative identity awareness scores and lower depression and anxiety. This description supports the narrative identity emerging adulthood literature and Pasupathy and Powell's 2007 model, which suggests that narrative identity develops over time as individuals engage in storytelling about their personal experiences to and with others. So as persona C is older, she has had more time to develop the abilities to engage in the complex process of becoming this autobiographical author. Additionally, persona C's lower depression and anxiety support McLean et al.'s 2020 finding that more positive or redemptive narratives are associated with more positive well-being. And since she's had more time to develop these narratives, then she's able to pick more positive and more redemptive narratives from that full life story. It also supports the Superwoman literature that states that the schema can have both negative and positive consequences on psychological experiences and well-being. So the persona profiles were created to identify the specific domains in which constructs provided a particularly good or particularly poor understanding of individuals' lives. So Halford and Meller's 2016 Awareness of Narrative Identity Questionnaire has typically shown high validity. However, the participants in this study scored relatively low on that measure, but relatively high on the cultural coherence facet, as well as high on the Superwoman questionnaire. With two of the three participants scoring the highest on the cultural coherence facet, we can infer two things. The first is that Hammock and McAdams and Powell's emphasis on how cultural narratives shape the personal stories people ascribe to, and reciprocally how personal stories sustain or transform culture, seems to definitely apply to the description of narrative identity awareness and these three personas. Secondly, due to the measure's validity but low scoring in this study, we see that this awareness of narrative identity questionnaire may not be the strongest way to assess narrative identity in the lives of African American women. With respect to case study literature, we can make a logical inference about how the nomothetic truth of narrative identity awareness does not seem to play out in the lives of African American women when culture is not central to the assessment. While the Superwoman narrative has been a social cultural aspect of identity development for African American women, as I was saying earlier, Generation Z has redefined the meaning of Black womanhood. I know probably many of you on the call have seen them actively taking a stance against identifying with the Superwoman and enduring what we call a soft life. These generational differences in how Black womanhood is defined is likely to explain why the Generation Z participants had lower scores on the Superwoman questionnaire and the cultural coherence facet of narrative identity overall, and why the millennial participants scored highest on both the Superwoman questionnaire and the cultural coherence facet. Also, in addition to emerging adulthood of narrative theory, research can suggest that stronger past perspectives are associated with stronger awareness of narrative identity, which aligns with Persona C scoring higher overall on the narrative identity awareness questionnaire, as a longer life has given her more time to formulate a past perspective and be aware of how that past perspective shapes her life story. So, while generational attributes to lower scores on the Superwoman questionnaire have been discussed, it is important to note that each participant still had a high Superwoman score. So, as stated earlier, African American women computer science majors are more susceptible to environments that are more susceptible to environments that present the challenges with the Superwoman's narrative function, and that is to reinterpret those experiences as a buffer to this harmful reality. So it is likely that while younger participants do not consciously subscribe to the narrative, this inhibitory nature of the self-memory system filters and interprets experiences through the narrative to promote goal-inducing behaviors that allow African American women to perform and maintain educational settings. This is in alignment with Harrell et al.'s 2011 study, Mwendwa's 2011 study, and Geronimus' Rethering framework. Another important note is that each Generation Z participant scored moderate to high on anxiety, depression, and the responsibility facets of the Big Five inventory. However, the millennial participant scored the lowest on the three on the anxiety and depression facets and highest on responsibility. There are multiple inferences that we can make here. So first, these findings support the inference that the context of educational settings and computer science identity are susceptible to the conditions in which the Superwoman narrative is, and psychological consequences are both positive and negative. Second, alignment with Malcolm Hall and Brown's double-blind phenomenon, in which women of color have to navigate gender racism in STEM. They are now part of various social groups that have competing identities. So computer scientists, which are seen as the white male-dominated majority, and African American and women, which are the marginalized minority. So lastly, these descriptions support the theory that the Superwoman exerts differential effects on African American women. For most, it serves as a protective function against multiple systems of oppression, invoking a sense of pride, and for others, it contributes to a sense of powerfulness, selflessness, and self-silencing that leads to an array of psychological problems. So I'll quickly run through the limitations of this study. So as I was saying earlier, the low numbers of African American women computer science majors contributed to such a small sample size, and it makes this a very niche population. And then online data collection during student midterms and final assessments. So we took this while students were taking midterms and finals, which could be a heightened time of stress. Next, we'll talk about future research. And so we would want to test the validity and reliability of that quantitative measure that was created for the study. We'd also like to employ the whole person collective case study approach to compare the lives of a larger cohort. So we definitely like to get that in and have larger groups go through this study. We like to compare and contrast college age students to that of adult age. So these are people who are returning to college, and analyze the quantitative data to examine the interrelationships between these variables. Lastly, we would like to eventually compare and contrast unique lived experiences of women in the United States to that of women in Africa. Africa has a huge population of computer science majors, women in computer science. So we really like to see how these differences in life experiences contribute to that identity and that health and well-being. And just to wrap up, I know we're close to time. In the conclusion, we wanted to know, what do we mean when we say we know African-American computer scientists? And the answer is really, we don't truly know, but we have a better idea. We have a better idea of how normative narrative identity development may differ in the lives of minority social groups, how traditional personality theories and Erikson are the application of theory may not fit certain social ethnic groups, how descriptions of strong identification with the superwoman narrative align with higher cultural narrative coherence, how descriptions of high agreeableness and conscientiousness align with high identification with the superwoman narrative in our sample, how high identification with superwoman narrative and the computer science identity showed higher anxiety and depression in the younger women in our sample, and how African-American computer science personality profiles showed high perceived stress. So lastly, we can say that theorists and researchers should definitely employ approaches that focus on racial and gender identity jointly to understand the unique psychological experience of African-American women in a racialized society. And as a narrative personality psychology and user experience researcher, it is my hope that my research will add to the current literature by connecting psychology, health research, and tech to demonstrate how the merging of the fields of industry plus social responsibility can add to the positive representations, experiences, equity, and well-being of marginalized social groups. Thank you.
Dr. Boney, that was amazing. And such an impressive body of work. I'm impressed that you can even communicate all that in an hour. I can imagine how long your dissertation took to deliver and how long it took for you to actually compile all of that information. Unfortunately, it's one, so we're not able to take any questions. But if anyone has any questions that they have for Dr. Boney, please just send them in to us and we can forward them her direction or link you up with her. I'm sure I could imagine all of the creative ways that this information can be applied as we look at creating better, safer environments for African women to succeed in STEM and also in university. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done.
And I'd love to share the slides so that they can be disseminated as well if people want to take a closer look.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, everyone, that we don't have time for questions, but if you please stay on the line because we have our next speaker.